everybody. Welcome to the first premier podcast, Theology of Money. I am Dan Catone. I am your host of this podcast. We're starting an incredible journey with three amazing theologians in our church. We're going to be discussing a variety of concepts and topics relating to the intersection of our faith and our money. And this is very exciting for me. I've got just three luminaries here with me today, my co-hosts on the show. And before I introduce them, I want to talk briefly about what we're trying to do with this podcast. And I guess what I'm trying to do with my life's mission. I've come to the conclusion, and this might be shocking to everybody, that American finance is not necessarily the most Catholic aspect of our society and culture. In fact, I would argue that a lot of finance is in opposition to the faith. And my mission in life is to help every single Catholic in America invest without compromise of conscience. Well, before we can do that, we have to understand the concepts that we're discussing. And these are concepts that on their own are well fleshed out. The concept of theology, of course, we have lots of ideas that come out of theology for the last hundreds or thousands of years. And finance has its own set of ideas that have come through all sorts of luminaries and thinkers and philosophers over the centuries. But bringing these two concepts of finance and theology together into a synthesized place is really what this podcast is all about. And so I asked myself, what would it look like if we're successful in this podcast? Well, we have theology of the body, and we have different aspects of theology that interact with or intersect with our life. And but we really don't have this idea of the theology of money fully built out within the United States for people to apply practically in their lives. But imagine what America would look like if everybody put Jesus Christ as the head of every aspect of our lives. Our marriages, our faith, of course, our careers, but also our IRAs and our 401ks. And so this podcast is dedicated to this very simple idea of helping you, our listeners and viewers, understand some of the more complex concepts, the basic concepts of theology relating to finance, but also giving you the practical steps for you to live a more virtuous life so that every aspect of your life can be under his mantle. So with that introduction, I'd like to introduce my co-hosts here today. And I think we'll start perhaps ladies first. So I think on my above me in the screen, and I don't know how it is with everybody watching this, I have Pia de Solenni, and Pia is a very talented professional in finance also and theology. She is the vice president of corporate engagement at IWP. They're a research organization that actually helps my company, Arimathea, do the work that we do for our clients. She's been a theological advisor to a bishop. And I was thinking about that. I want to say it was St. Macrina who helped St. Gregory, her brother, I believe, write a book. And he was on the body and soul, if I'm not mistaken. And what a beautiful idea that a bishop can take instruction from a theologian that's not an ordained person at all. And I think that's really a beautiful idea that wisdom can come from different parts of the church. And Pia certainly led the way there, with an emphasis on kind of a renewal of feminism within a Catholic ethos is, I think, Pia's main focus. And with a deep background, also on working for the I think it was the Family Research Council, if I'm not mistaken, as well in DC. So Pia, welcome. Oh, we don't have your audio because you're muted, but we're all new here, so that's fine. But welcome.
Thank
Pia.
you, Daniel. Good to be with you.
Thank you. All right. And to Pia's left and kind of kitty corner to me, we have Dr. Chris Owens. Chris and I haven't known each other for very long. We've actually just got to know each other in the last couple of months. And I believe, Chris, you're working over at the Belmont Abbey doing theological instruction there. And that you studied, I want to say at the Augustine Institute, didn't you?
No, sorry, I was at the Angelicum in Rome.
The Angelicum, excuse me. The Angelicum
right, yeah.
in Rome. Yes. That's incredible in itself. And you came back to the United States, and you've been doing work now at Belmont Abbey, which is pretty. I've been there, actually. I went there, I guess, about 6 months with Jimmy Coleman, our chief growth officer. It's a beautiful, beautiful campus. And Chris, it's my understanding you're writing a dissertation on predestination. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I'm working on the connection between the end individual who's predestined and the eternal predestination in the mind of God. This middle piece that seems to be missing from a lot of church history is the role of the church in predestination, and so that's really exciting work to be able to explore further.
That's fascinating. So I'm trying to think if there's any topic more heady than the theology of money, and it certainly would be predestination. So I congratulate you on trying to suss out all the knowledge that we can in that subject. And then to my right is Dr. Christopher Blum. He's a former provost at the Augustine Institute and is a professor of history and philosophy at the Augustine Institute. And tell me if I got your book correct. You wrote a book called "A Mind at Peace: Reclaiming the Ordered Soul in an Age of Distraction." Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, but I think I should because I'm probably the least silent or ordered soul that you know, and I think I could use some instruction there. But Dr. Christopher Blum, also a bit of a mentor of mine, is one of the reasons why I founded Arimathea, our asset management company, and eventually this podcast. He probably doesn't remember this, but it's an important moment in my life. I was just finishing up my Augustine Institute master's degree in theology, which I never thought I would do, having come from a life of dissipation and certainly not, in a sense, the Catholic I wish I had been in my younger years. But I sat down and had a cup of coffee with Dr. Blum. And I said, I'm thinking about kind of two paths here. I could go on to school and become a professor or a doctor and maybe do some more work in theology, or I could just go out back into the world and work in finance again. And Dr. Blum said, I think you should do that one, the second one. We need people out there in the vineyard doing the work. And I don't know if that was a nice way of saying I don't have the chops to be a theologian. I would agree with you, but it certainly inspired me. So, Dr. Blum, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited.
Well, praise God. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah. And so we have two Chris's here. We have Christopher Blum and Chris Owens, but I'm just going to call you all doctor. So to make it even more confusing. So, I think Dr. Owens, you sent me some information, like an email with some concepts that you were thinking about in terms of theology of money. And there was something that stood out to me that I thought was really, really interesting. And that was that our viewers and listeners are being given sort of the practical application of theology through the 2021 USCCB documents, which kind of outlines the way in which the USCCB wishes to invest. Some from Mensarum Bonum, the document that came out of the Vatican recently, or a couple of years ago. But you made the point that we have to have a foundational knowledge of theology and money and the intersection of these things, both from tradition and from Scripture. And I think that's very reasonable, and I think that's very accurate. So I'm gonna pick on you, Dr. Owens, first. Can you please walk me through why you think a foundational knowledge of these concepts is important before we get to the practical application?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Daniel. St. Thomas Aquinas says in the beginning of his very first work in his Opera Omnia, as it's at least compiled by the editors, that a little error in principles results in a large error in the conclusion. Yeah, and so when we're dealing with the practical ethical issues, or just any question of practical reasoning and judgment, we're going to have an application to a particular some principle and some foundation for why we're going to act, or why we're going to not act, which is also a moral action, right? The choice not to act in this or that way. And so it's really important to know our principles, from which we're acting. And I think, for my own interest in this area, when we're living and working in a liberal society where the value of money has become detethered, in some instances from something real, then what that money represents, whether it's in our labor, our productive efforts on some raw good, or whether it's intellectual idea that has some value. How this resource is utilized towards the common good needs to be just thought. Doesn't need to be well thought out. I mean, in a certain sense, going to the grocery store and buying a Coca-Cola is the most natural and easy thing in our daily life. But in another way, what underpins and what we don't see in those daily transactions is really important, and I think it's just a good thing to understand the principles, to reflect on those principles, and to be have greater intention in how we go about our daily economic life.
I appreciate those comments a lot. I think you make a very important point, Chris, Professor Owens. I want us to really dive into this on the principles and the basics of the theology first before we get into the practicality of things. And I think you were wise to steer us in that direction. Dr. Blum, I took a class from you. I had a class from you at the Augustine Institute on secularism, and it was one of my favorite classes. And I was wondering if you could. I'm kind of walk you through this idea, and I was curious if you could give me your feedback on it. I think the secular world, in finance specifically, they order goods for us. I say the financial service industry is about 50 years old. The 401k was, I think, invented in like 1976 or something. And the Roth IRA is 25 years old, so it's now old enough to rent a car. But a lot of this idea of saving for retirement, collecting some nest egg, not working anymore, and then living off of your money through the rest of your years, I guess, sipping Mai Tais on the beach until oblivion. I mean, this is something that has been sold to us for the last 30, 40, 50 years. And I was wondering if you could start by helping us understand how the ordering of goods, myself, others, God, or charity in financial planning, is wrong. What's being taught to us by the secular world. And I have some ideas what it should be, but I was curious what you think first.
Boy, thank you, Dan. You specialize in big questions.
I do. It's our first episode. We might as well start big.
Big, yeah. In recent years, I taught that course again with great joy and sort of a mounting sense of urgency, because I think that the culture that surrounds us, particularly since the second Obama administration, is just more and more confident, right? And it's one thing if the secular culture is just people kind of lapsing into a kind of lazy way of living, lazy selfishness, right? That's one thing. But when secularism becomes more confident, it becomes a little bit more of a program. And as you say, right, there's a kind of prepackaged way of looking at human things that's presented to us. Back in 1976, I think it was, Karol Wojtyła was brought down to the Vatican to give the Lenten sermons to the Roman Curia, St. Paul VI. These were subsequently published under the title A Sign of Contradiction. And it was a really interesting piece because, in effect, it was an archbishop coming from the communist bloc to talk to the secularizing West, right? So he was sort of warning the Curia of what's coming. And right at the beginning of those retreats, he says something really haunting. Present-day man does not think things through to the end. Present-day man does not think things through to the end. And I think that takes us right to sort of the hallmark of secularism, right? The premise here is that God does not need to be honored, right? Maybe there's a God, but he's just off there on a shelf somewhere. He's just keeping the lights on, right? Whoever he is, we don't need to honor him, right? We go about our business with ourselves in mind. And as you suggest, if we do this in finance, we're getting things absolutely backwards, right? All good things come to us from God, which is why our ancestors under the Old Covenant gave back to God the first fruits, right? Not the back end of their income, but the best and the sort of top of their wealth or their income, right? The notion of tithing, right? And I think that if we can recapture a proper notion of tithing, right? What it's for the sake of, how it relates to our own decisions and so forth, then that can help us reorder. So sorry to go practical on you there. Okay.
No, it's okay.
But,
we're going to get there eventually anyways.
Yeah. But I think that's kind of the flip that needs to happen. If God is coming first, what does that mean exactly? Well, it has something to do with how we set aside first what we've already received from him.
It's funny how we just lapse into the practical so easily, but it makes sense. We're not Gnostics. We are embodied beings, and the practical application of all of this is super critical. And so I'm glad you did start to touch on the practical. And I'm not going to ask you if we should buy Bitcoin or Ethereum if we want to get super practical, but we will talk about that. I think it'll be interesting to discuss the way in which we choose investments and what those can be, whether they're speculative or not. I remember you wrote a really nice article quite a few years ago on speculative investing. Part of it was on speculative investing, and I wrote a little bit of a critique back to you on it, and I think we'll riff on that a little bit too, because I might have some different ideas on the place for speculative investing in a portfolio. That when we get to the practical, folks, we're not quite there yet. And actually, before we move on to you, Pia, I want to just come back to you on something, Dr. Blum. And I want to read you a quote. And this is since you mentioned him, Pope St. John Paul II. He said, "The Church acknowledges the legitimate role of profit as an indication that a business is functioning well." It's very interesting that he says an indication that a firm or a business is functioning well is the profit, but it's not the only indication. And I think my question to you, Dr. Blum, can you think of any other markers that you would want to see in a business to say that it's functioning well from a Catholic perspective?
No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, this is the beginning of a long journey, right? And there's a lot of questions that fall under that one. But I think the first thing that I would say, with a kind of nod toward John Paul II's encyclical on work, on the dignity of labor, Laborem Exercens, right, is that I would look for a company that inside itself is doing some, providing some good or service to the broader world that brings in the profits, right? But that the people who are working for that company and providing that legitimate good or service are themselves being ennobled by the work, right? That they take a due pride in their work because they're offering something good to society, and they find a kind of rational satisfaction in doing that work and are thus ennobled by it. That's what I'd look for first.
I think that's great, and I agree with it. I want to explore in our podcast later on accusations of socialism, because I think when we start talking about social justice and common good and the role of the worker and all of those types of things, it's very easy for sort of seculars on the right to point at us and say, what are these socialist Catholics all about? And I think it's a misunderstanding. So I'd like to flush that out at a later date. So thank you very much, Dr. Blum. All right, Dr. de Solenni, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
Fantastic, actually.
Great.
Never been better. I listened to a podcast that you were on, actually, with Lila Rose.
Okay.
I don't know if you remember doing that one?
I do. Yeah.
I don't remember. It wasn't too long ago, was it?
I think it was last summer.
Oh, okay. So pretty recent. Yeah, she's a great interviewer and a great activist. First of all, you mentioned that you grew up on a ranch.
I did. Yeah. My dad was just deep in Bullock and Chesterton. He was an attorney, and my friends call him the hillbilly intellectual. And they were the original crunchy conservatives. We had carob and honey and ground our own wheat and raised our own animals. And my dad grew artichokes to try and figure out how to make fuel from them.
Wow. Okay.
And on and on and on and on.
Well, I mentioned it because above my head here is actually a flag of the state of Wyoming. I'm raising my family on a ranch here in Wyoming. And so I think you and my wife would get along very, very well. She's about as crunchy as it gets.
I look forward to meeting her.
I'm sure you get along great. So, you actually, in that interview, you said something that someone else said that I thought was really, really interesting. You were in Rome. You studied in Rome, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I did my doctorate there.
Yeah. And I want to come back to that here in a second. But you had mentioned that you had gone to confession. And the priest had said to you after your confession that possession of virtue is not the same thing as knowledge of virtue.
Right.
And due to what Dr. Blum had instructed me many years ago, I kind of fell in love with virtue ethics in a lot of ways. And so I have a great appreciation for anything related to virtue topics. And so I was curious what you think about the application of virtue in theology or in finance specifically. So how do we, maybe a more specific question, how do we smuggle in the Catholic virtues into money and finance in an industry that largely has no interest in virtue? So curious what you think about that.
Well, it comes down to actions, right? How we act. So from our business at IWP Capital, we're looking to see, first of all, does the company make a product or service that's good, ethical? If it's intrinsically wrong, abortion, sorry, we can't. That's a fail for us, right? But then we do the proxy voting, and that's where we get into issues of governance. And this is where we begin to apply some principles like how much does a CEO make? How long has somebody been on the board? How have they been on the board for 25 years and they don't show up for meetings? A lot of different things. And that governance will affect how the company runs. Now, recently, so I was at a private meeting of evangelical money managers and evangelical institutional investors and some of their private equity people, so companies that they had invested in. And I have to tell you, I was so impressed. I'd love to see, there have to be these stories in the Catholic space, but these are companies that do something good, right? Then they treat their employees well, they pay them well, they have an employee support system, they have a very high employee rate of retention. If somebody has a problem, they don't have to quit their job. They're going to be helped no matter how bad it is. They will be helped. You have an addiction issue, someone's going to help you. There's an employee benevolence fund. So a certain percentage of profits goes into that to help employees who are in need. So I don't know, somebody's porch is falling apart. A whole bunch of people are going to show up on a weekend and fix the porch, right? They're very connected. They're also very proud of the fact that they have people coming to know Christ. And so some of these places will even have baptisms. They have a place at work where they do baptisms. And this is a big thing for them. And Catholics, I think we have tried so hard, particularly in the United States. I mean, it's a cultural thing, right? To fit in. I mean, we've been trying to fit in since probably the 1940s. And, when JFK was elected, we thought we finally arrived. We've, now we're part of the mainstream. And so we were never... And we also don't have a tradition of proselytization. So those are different things, right? But I think that the examples in the Catholic space have to be out there, but it's always, everything that we do in our work at IWP is always the dignity of the human person. So other organizations will screen investments, they'll do proxy voting, corporate engagement, according to different issues. And for us, it's always the dignity of the human person. And so any issue that we're screening for, any issue that we're voting on, the highest point is the dignity of the human person. And so I think at the end of the day, when we apply these things, we have to say, how is this business, how does this benefit the dignity of each human person that comes into contact with it? Are they made better for it? Is the world a better place because of this company and the products that it makes, the way it treats its employees? Because the way that it treats its employees, that's going to have a ripple effect, right? They're going to treat other people similarly.
See, look at us getting so practical so quickly.
That's why I chose moral theology.
I see that. Yes, I think that's really cool. Actually, I remember in that podcast with Lila Rose, you did mention that moral theology is really practical theology. And I very much appreciate that. And so I'm doing my best to keep us all as high level as possible on this first episode. And we are failing miserably, but that's okay. We'll just lean into that. So, I want to address, a couple big questions about our audience. There are families out there, there's probably a mom listening to this show right now that's got 7 kids, and they're trying to figure out just how to get the homeschooling organized and make sure that there's food for lunch and everything else that needs to happen. And dad's off there doing his work maybe and earning some money. And they may not even have enough money to even put $50 a month into an IRA or whatnot. They might just be hand to mouth. It's an old story for Catholics, I think. What would you say, and I'll take any of you on this one. What would you say to that mom on why Theology of Money is relevant at all to her life, which is diapers and cooking and, making sure that the kids are learning the faith?
Because she's probably thinking about money a lot.
You think so?
I think she is.
Tell me more.
All the moms I know, they're concerned with the household budget. They see the needs. You're thinking about kids' education, whether it's in the home, out of the home. Children cost money to raise. Families cost money. You have a house. Money is a constant theme. It's the thing that married couples argue about the most, well, that and in-laws. But it's something that is on everybody's plate all day long.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes women more than men, particularly if you're talking about a traditional model in which the husband is the breadwinner, because the wife is dealing, again, she's back in that realm of the practical, and her practical is all these people who need something. She needs something, her husband needs something. They probably have parents, extended family, and then obviously the children. Yeah. So And John Paul II says, I think it's in Mulieris Dignitatem, he says that the gift of the woman is the ability to see the person. So, you men are brilliant, but I think women are brilliant too. Anyway, but you guys have like this, when you're in your workspace, you have an amazing ability to filter out and go down the deep rabbit hole, right? My husband, when he starts to work, I think bombs could be going off and he would not lose his concentration, right? And so it's a different aspect. And whereas women, particularly those who are in traditional stay-at-home roles, all they're thinking about all day long is the needs of other people. Yeah. Sometimes they don't even have time to think about their own needs, which that's a topic for another podcast. So that's why I think money is relevant. It's important, and it's being talked about, or at least thought about all the time. Honestly, I hope it's a conversation that's happening, a healthy conversation back and forth, because I've seen some cases. I knew one woman who didn't have, her husband controlled all the finances. She had no access to the accounts. And I kept pushing her. I said, what happens if your husband gets hit by a bus? I'm sorry, but people do drop dead sometimes. Yeah. And finally, after years, he gave her access. I've known women that are put on such a tight budget that they have to ask their husbands for everything. Now we're going to get into the theology of marriage. I think that's flawed. But there you go.
Well, I think you might be detecting it was a bit of a loaded question for your background. So, Pia,
I wonder if I could chime in here a little bit. Yeah, I was thinking about it not in terms of money directly, but in terms of what money represents, right? So money comes into the household through labor, right? And labor is something certainly that a stay-at-home mom does all day, every day, even if there isn't necessarily a paycheck attached to it. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it's more real and more valuable. Chesterton makes this point in his great book, What's Wrong with the World, where he distinguishes between the public house and the private house, mm-hmm. and the societal attribution of the value of work. And he says society raises up the value of the work being done in the public house, which of course is a good English phrase, the pub, right? He's sort of making fun at the work that men do in the public house, because it's not really the important work. Chesterton notes that's for the sake of the work that's happening in the private house, right? The other thought that I had was labor is a curse, right? I mean, it is the curse given in Genesis 3, right? And labor. This is something that when I was teaching to the undergrads, I'd remind them labor is not only the curse given, but it's also through the labor of Christ, that redemption is gained, right? The labor of Christ on the cross. And so our participation in labor is a redemptive sort of suffering, right? That when united to Christ, switching that, interchanging that back out to the question of money directly. Money is a tool that should be used and thought of as a part of our path to salvation, right? We have to be wary. There's all kinds of moral questions, but it's Sorry, Christopher's going to jump in.
Yeah, I love this question. I'm thinking of two homeschooling moms I know. One has 11 kids, the other 2. So that you could get an average of your 7 there.
Yeah.
Right. They're doing that work that Chris Owens is talking about, of forming culture for their children. Right. Beautiful work, extraordinary work. And part of that formation that these mothers I'm thinking of, part of the formation that they're giving to their children is they're giving them an initial orientation to what's happening in America today in terms of culture and politics and so forth. And high finance is right at the center of what's going on today, right? The whole woke revolution of the past 3 years was hatched in Harvard Business School and driven in boardrooms. Right. And also the key figures who are shaping our culture on either side of the aisle, whether it's Elon Musk or Bill Gates or whomever, right? These people are billionaires. They're operating in the space of finance, whatever else they're doing, right? They're doing lots of things, but they're certainly operating in that space of finance. And so the big questions about finance, the big questions about money, what it's for, how it's used, where it's come from, right? These are questions that are daily relevant to the formation of the family.
Yeah, I think all of you make some very important points on these subjects. It's Dr. Blum. It's like you were mentioning Elon Musk and Bill Gates, and sometimes I sit around with some of my male friends, and we smoke cigars on Saturday evenings at my friend's house. And his wife is quite the saint to allow us all to do that there. It comes with all the smell of the cigars, but
that's the first thing I thought of.
Yeah, I have a little cigar room downstairs, but my wife installed a really nice vent, so it doesn't go up into the kitchen. But anyways, we'll sit around and talk about all kinds of concepts, and there's always like one or two gentlemen there who are very traditional, and they talk about how we should have an American monarchy, like a Catholic monarch, instead of this democracy thing that we're doing. And my pushback is always, the American monarch would be Elon Musk or Bill Gates or whoever, some frankly person who has no relationship to the faith whatsoever, because that's what we've built in our society. Is our kings are these titans of industry, and so I can't think of somebody further on the spectrum of life. Say Elon Musk, and then the moms with 11 kids or 2 kids at home. I mean, these are very, very, very far apart in a lot of ways.
Careful, he's got 14 children.
Yeah, well, that's a whole
another podcast. Sorry.
You live in like a little village commune thing. I don't know what's going on with all that. But my point is, my point that I'm kind of meandering towards on this is, all of you have laid out this vision of theology of money, and the way it interacts with our lives, intersects with our lives in a practical effect. And I can't help but think how dramatically different it is from what the secular world is telling us about finance. Almost to the point of hopelessness, like the idea of human dignity and, workers and the way in which we participate in the common good. I mean, these are topics, as a finance person myself, we don't even talk about this in normal finance. It's not even on the radar of interest for us. So my question to you is, what do we do? Like, how do we help people that are even tangentially related to Catholicism? Maybe it's these folks who have just kind of forgotten about Christ in a sense. It's like a society of the new evangelization. It's a society has to be reintroduced to our Lord. I guess let's get practical a little bit. Like, what would you say would be a practical way to help people reframe everything? I mean, we are fish in the sea, right? And this sea is secularism. And I know all of you are doing that work, so you've got different answers. So let's hear you out.
The first thing I was thinking about there is you mentioned monarchy, and America as a founding experiment is very different than the nation states, the emergence of the modern states in Europe. In that there wasn't a transcendent good around which all of the founding colonists necessarily agreed on, right? They maybe agreed, in individual clusters of groups, and so, but they certainly they disagreed between each other, right, and between the colonies on this. I think this presents a practical challenge on a vision for common life and society. When you can't agree on a transcendent end, and as Catholics, of course, we proclaim Jesus Christ and heaven as our final end. But when you can't agree on that transcendent end, then you sort of have to settle on means you can agree on, right? This is sort of the emergence of liberal society, right? It seems like that very quickly can create a lowest common denominator of economic utility, whereby my neighbor, whom I might disagree with fundamentally on values in the world, we can at least help each other pursue our own ends, even if they're opposed to each other. The whole question of liberalism in economics and how it impacts economics, I think kind of come in tandem together.
I think you're right. And before I hear from the other folks here, and this might be kind of controversial, and I'm fine with that, but what is the end of capitalism? The end of capitalism is maximization of profit. There's some nuance we can do there. What is the end of Catholicism? The end of Catholicism is the love of God and our union and theosis with him. We automatically have opposition. Like, we already have a problem here because, capitalism can be virtuous, theoretically, but it has to smuggle in things from Catholicism. Like, it's not going to be virtuous on its own, right? But if I were to ask some of my friends, especially my conservative friends, which I'm kind of in the middle, I would say, what's wrong with capitalism? A lot of them are hard pressed to say. If I ask what's wrong with socialism, I get a long list. Easy. But I ask what's wrong with capitalism, and it's like, well, I don't know. What do you think's wrong?
Oh, I would say that both capitalism, capitalism, socialism, communism, they see the worker as an object, not as a subject. And the problem with capitalism is that as long as it doesn't see the worker as a subject, well, fundamentally, do we see money as a means to something or as an end in itself? And there's a few lines about not being able to serve mammon and gods, both God and mammon. So we have to choose, and it's a question of how we orient ourselves in this capitalist system. But extreme capitalism means that profit is, at the end of the day, is the primary goal, which means then you're not concerned necessarily with the well-being of your employees. And I mean, this is part of the reason that Leo the 13th wrote Rerum Novarum, because there were some
Right
really
there.
serious
Yep.
issues going on. And I found that document fascinating because there's just, well, for many reasons, but and I think it's really undervalued in this
My favorite
conversation.
encyclical, just for the record.
There you go. With good reason. There's a part where he says that the virtue of religion, if you don't have a roof over your head and you don't have food to eat, or it's very difficult to have those things, that it's very difficult to practice the virtue of religion. I would say even heroic. Obviously, some people do. Most people can't. You need a basic modicum of living in order to be able to think about the higher things. And in a previous life, I was working with a project. There was a project in the Philippines where they were actually, what they were doing was this is a culture, this particular microculture is one in which people earn money in the morning so that they can eat at night, right? And that's every day. They don't have a savings. So where do you have the time for mass, for catechesis? Where do you have the time to get to know God? So this program was actually set up so that people would have something to eat on that one day so that they could therefore worship God, go to mass, learn something about their faith. But these are big questions. And I think without Catholicism, I'm not sure that capitalism is human. I can't think of how it could be. I think it needs the guidance of Christianity. And that's what's impressed me about some of these companies that I was put in contact with recently. I mean, it's beautiful to see. And I think this is, and I understand it's harder in the private sector than in the public sector, right?
Yes.
But, again, that's a bigger conversation. But it is something that fundamentally we have to bring, where does the human person fit into this?
Boy, if capitalism is not human, where does it come from?
Well, it's the separation of labor and capital, right? Back to first principles, okay? In the very encyclical of Leo the 13th, right? The Pope, he lays down as a fundamental principle that the product of your labor should be owned by the laborer, right? And the separation of labor from capital, which makes the employee, a sort of a serf, a wage serf to the business owner, rather than owning some share in the product that he's producing or she's producing. That's the beginning of an error that leads to a sort of valuing of profit above worker conditions or other things, right?
I won't call you Comrade Owens, but I'm close. I'm close to it.
No. I love the free market. Don't get me wrong.
I feel like we have to say that in order, to check off a box. But I appreciate that.
But
very
a truly
much.
free market, right? A truly free market, right?
I think there's such a thing. I would argue there is no such thing.
Freedom as opposed to license, right? These are two different concepts.
Well, it's the old joke is what socialism's never been tried. Well, neither has capitalism. Then I think we could point the same finger at both. But Dr. Blum, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, just to harken back to your first provocative question, right? Are we in a state of hopelessness here? And I think we're not. I think it's important to affirm that we can imagine, I think pretty easily actually, a world in which we don't feel tyrannized over by money and our concern for money. Okay, and I think we can imagine that world if we cultivate a habit of keeping the Lord's Day holy.
Mm-hmm.
So if on the Lord's Day, on Sunday, we're dialing down our telecommunications, from 12, where it is Monday through Friday, down to about a 2, right? I mean, we're going to still call grandma, right? But we're dialing that thing down, right? We're turning off the TV or putting it in a closet. We're going to mass first, right? And then some commercial, non-media, family and friend type activities for the rest of the day, maybe finishing off the day with a rosary or with evening prayer, who knows, right? Every family is going to do things differently according to their genius, right? But if we can cultivate a habit of a Lord's Day in which we're not being pulled by websites and stores and work and so forth, if we live that way for a while, then we're going to have a real sort of foundation or ground. We're going to have something under our fingernails of what it would be like to be free interiorly from the tyranny of money.
And if I can just jump in, I think I love what you said, Dr. Blum, and I would add to that, like, just an element of fun. Like, have fun on it. David danced before the Lord. I mean, it's okay to have fun. We're not, and so I think we need to, particularly in families, find ways to have fun together that don't involve devices. Right. And so one family I know, they're fabulous on board games. And my husband and I love visiting them because it's a ton of fun. And in fact, my husband got Terraforming Mars, which is like, look that up. So we tried to play that game with his parents. And I had served French 75s before dinner, and this is after dinner. So you do the math. And so it was it's this really brainiac game, so hard to figure out. And one of my friends happens to mention totally separately that her family loves this game, Terraforming Mars. And I said, well, do you know how to play it? And she said, yeah. And she said, we'll show you. So they showed us. It turned out you have to get a little add-on from Etsy that makes it easier. It's better if you haven't had French 75s along with dinner and so forth. Works a lot better. But it's just a fun thing. And it's wonderful to see this family, how they gather together. And sometimes we do it in other family situations. We'll just bring a game of some sort. And it's also really interesting because you see different strengths coming out from people that you wouldn't otherwise know. So I don't know. I would just look for fun. I mean, it's just, when I was teaching high school for a very brief time after college, there was a concert that was happening, and some of the parents didn't want their kids. It was a big, people were fighting about it. Kids were fighting about it. And one of the kids, I just listened for once, and I listened to one of the kids talking, and he says, somebody said, well, aren't you mad that your dad's not going to let you go? And he said, no, my dad's taking us kayaking. So it's just, I think that those are really special times to cultivate.
That's an
Daniel,
idea. Oh, sorry. Chris, go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, you started with a sort of oblique reference to the new evangelization. Mm-hmm. I think what Pia and Christopher just elaborated on here is precisely that. The way we're going to affect the larger question of society's view on the economy is not going to be through a large program. It's not going to be through an institutional sort of USCCB kind of coalition building approach, right? It's going to be this family by their witness of life. This is what John Paul II says in the encyclical on the new evangelization, right? Yeah. It's their witness of life that inspires, and he's echoing Paul VI there, right? But that's not enough. At some point, there has to be a proclamation of the gospel, and I would add a gospel of money that is internally consistent and practical. But it starts with that witness of life that shows what's different about my relationship, what's been changed about my life and my family's life because of our communion with our Lord, and how does that change my life? And an invitation, how does that change your life?
I think you both are touching on a very interesting subject, the idea of fun and witness. From a personal note, my mother-in-law, she became a Mormon when she was young, a little girl, when she was living in Mexico, from a Catholic family, and she was we don't really know what happened, but regardless, she ended up working for and kind of becoming a part of the Pratt family, which is a major Mormon family that moved down to Mexico to, I think, to do a little polygamy, something like that. But in all seriousness, in reality, though, she was raised in this, eventually made a family in the Mormon faith, which I absconded my wife from. God be praised. So she and I were talking a few years ago over dinner, and she's not a Catholic, and she's not really Mormon anymore either. She's a long story, but we're talking. I said, you look at my family, and I said, judge our faith and the truth of our faith by our lives. And if you see a joy in our family, ask where it comes from. Because that's the reality of things. And what, Pia, you're getting to, this idea of fun. Capitalism has no use for fun except in service to game theory to make more profits. So if you look at a corporation, if they make their product fun, why? Are they making the product fun just for the whimsical idea of fun, that we're just going to have a little bit more joy in our lives? Nope. It's in order to induce you to buy more product or dive deeper into their product or whatever. And I guess this gets to my main point, and that is capitalism has a way of devouring everything around it. Everything seems to be recategorized or prioritized or given a denomination or a price. And so whether it be time or fun or even the faith itself, capitalism has a way to put a price tag on it. And there's something about pricing things that are never meant to be bought and sold. Human beings, for example, like we used to do in capitalism, in slavery, that is deeply disturbing. And so I was curious if any of you have any thoughts about capitalism's ability to consume and devour. That's a tough one. Dr. Blum.
Boy, you're awfully provocative this morning,
Dan. That's our first episode. I told you we'd dive right in.
I'm going to be provocative right back. I really don't like words that end in ISM because when I hear them, I usually reach back and see if my wallet's still there. I'm never really sure what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right. So I think capital, right? That is to say, land or tools or some kind of invention, something that's more sort of purely intellectual, that can serve as a means of producing some good or service that helps human beings. Capital is something that the Lord has furnished the earth and the human race with, and we're grateful for it, right? I'm just really glad that I've got a shovel because in my new backyard I've got some dirt that's in the wrong place. So, that's a modest example of capital in my private life anyway. And so if we can sort of divide the issue, right? I think that in a secular society that's lost sight of the love of God, that's lost sight of at least the key elements of the dignity of the human person, right? Might still have a grasp of some of the accidents of how to treat human beings, but have lost really the essence there. This society is going to get everything wrong. So of course it's going to get money wrong and corporations wrong and so forth. So, if we can divide that issue, then and maybe use other words than capitalism, then I'll be very happy to talk about what's wrong with it.
Well, I'm not going to quarrel over words and definitions with you. You would win that fight anyways. The only ism I like is Catholicism, I think. But your point is well taken, Dr. Blum. It is difficult to even define terms in economics sometimes because economics is so maybe finance is a better way of putting this. Finance is so practical that it rarely looks up from the balance sheet. And so I think you make a very, very important point, but I would like to hear what Pia and the other Chris have to say about capitalism, the means of exchange of goods using contracts and price with demand and supply as the primary motivating engine of that. I guess we could call that capitalism. Can you tell me, if you guys can tell me, do you think that capitalism is all-consuming and devouring? Or maybe I'm talking about something else entirely. Maybe just talking about Americanism. I don't know. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think original sin is all consuming and devouring. So,
It is in my life.
It's just capitalism can be all consuming and devouring. And again, this comes back to the question of, well, who's engaged in this activity? Who are the people? How have they been formed? And so I just think that there's such deeper questions, and it means, why education and formation is so important. Just regardless of what side you sit on politically, just look at the landscape right now. There are certain basic moral principles that are completely out the window, that do not exist in either political party. And there are a lot of behaviors that are very normative across both platforms. So to me, the bigger issue, instead of is capitalism all consuming, I want to look at the people who are involved. And it's a lot of people, earlier I used the language of object and subject. It's a lot of people who see other people as objects, not subjects. And to me, that's the problem.
Yeah, commodification of the person.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, long before Adam Smith, there were moral issues in society that the church addressed. And when I teach Catholic social teaching, I might be like bad for this, but when I teach Catholic social teaching to undergrads, I don't start with the 7 principles of Catholic social teaching from the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. That is not where I start. We get there, right, towards the end of the class. Where I start with are the encyclicals and ecumenical councils of the Church, which in the first instance condemn slavery and condemn usury. Right? If you want to talk about a moral issue that has been condemned more than any other moral issue in the history of the church, it's usury. And so long before Adam Smith and modern kind of notions of capitalism, the church has had a grave concern for the person. And the condition of the worker in relation to others in society, and that's something that's hard. It's tangible, hard, easy, but it's tangible, right? To talk about slavery is bad. Usury is a little more ethereal at first glance, but students understand that slavery is bad, and that allows us to outline some of those principles. What is a just title to someone's labor, right? Mm-hmm. A claim on someone's labor, and how do those same kind of principles, when they turn into simply numbers on a balance sheet, how do those same kinds of principles help us to very easily identify, ethical decision making in money? So but I'd say I think Pia is right on the money, right? Original sin. Right, and maybe the only most truly virtuous response is the religious life. It seems like that's what our Lord is calling the rich young man to, right? When he says, "I've studied the law, I've followed the teachings since my youth. What must I do?" What does our Lord says? He says, "Well, go give away everything and follow me." Right. And I think that's a calling of our Lord, of that young man to the religious life.
I think you might be right. I've not thought of it that way before, but I can certainly see it. I appreciate you guys pushing back with me on this. And I want to read you, and we're wrapping up here. We only got a couple minutes left, but I wanted to read a passage from Scripture and then maybe take a little devil's advocate position on this. Not that he needs any advocacy, but let me read it to you. Do not lay up for yourselves treasure on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So my challenge to you then is we should not save money for the future. We should not store up treasure here on earth. We should not fund our IRAs. Perhaps it's usurious, I don't know. But the point is we should just cast ourselves into the arms of our Lord, trust him entirely, and not store up treasures on earth, just like he said in the Bible.
I think it's a question of where your heart is at. Is your heart wrapped up in these treasures? I mean, I think if you if you walk out, I think God would think you were stupid, quite frankly, if you're not going to fund your retirement or your 401k, you're not going to have a roof over your head. I mean, you do need material things according to your state in life. But the question is again, it's the question of mammon or God. Where is your heart in these things? And that to me is the bigger question. And I often wonder too, even the rich young man, it's really, give away everything that you have. That's also a fundamental heart thing. I mean, you can enter religious life and your heart's not given to God. And I mean, I see plenty of families where their hearts are given to God, and that's why they love their spouses, they love their children, they love everybody around them, because it's where the heart is. And so, I mean, we can all think of people in religious life, they're not the greatest examples, but it's really, I guess I would challenge. I think it's a more fundamental question. And also, what are you doing with your goods? Are they meant for the service of others? I mean, I would love on another podcast, let's just talk about endowments.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, now, if you want to talk about something that's fundamentally flawed, I'm happy to go there. But I think we get to a point where we're talking about sums of money that, again, bringing it back to the family, I know of people who are wealthy and they don't necessarily leave it all to their kids. They want to fund things now, not after they're dead. And I also question, like, if we're going to live really comfortably now and then whatever's extra, then we'll give that to God. Then we'll give that to the poor or whatever cause. That we're not feeling any pain. I'm not sure that that's what we're called to do. I think, again, the detachment and where is our heart? And if we're not willing to part with our goods, to share our goods now, then that suggests to me that our hearts are entwined in those goods, not in God.
And it's a hard distinction. I mean, how much of my money do I set aside for this and for that? And, if I have an IRA when I'm retired, it's $5 million, let's say, and I only need 3. What do I do with the 2? I think these are questions that are practical, but I think they touch this nerve. Like I said, the world has been selling us this idea of accumulation of as much as possible. It used to be, the man with the most toys wins, or dies with the most toys wins, some ridiculous statement like that. But I think we've shifted. I don't think it's about toys. I mean, the grind culture that exists with young people. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. I'm not a young person myself, but I know a few, and they talk about, having 2 and 3 jobs and starting this business and that business, and none of it has to do with the Lord. It is all about accumulation of material wealth. And to your point, Pia, if that's where you place your heart.
But some people have to do that too.
Oh,
I mean,
of course.
that's the thing, is that, if you're looking at student debt, if you're looking at trying to start a family, just to have a house, it's the way things are set up right now. It's hard for a lot of people. And I talked to one woman who said her daughter has no expectation ever being able to get married and have a family because of the socioeconomic situation reality of her life.
Right. And that's part of the tragedy of all this, and why I sort of began our questioning with this question of hopelessness. It's as if we've designed an economic system that encourages vice. That I mean, aside from the fact that virtue is not even a point of discussion, and we, like McIntyre said, we might not have the language to discuss it anymore, but we have a system that encourages vice. And how does a Catholic engage in the world, not be of the world, when every single voice around them, with very little exception, is saying vice, 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 involving money whatsoever? So, Dr. Blum, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Well, I don't know how original my thoughts are. I'm very much in admiration of what I've been listening to from the rest of you, and especially what Pia said here about the heart. What we're interested in, each of us can be described with different words, right? Peace, joy, happiness. Those are three, good ones. Freedom might be more to the point, depending on what we're experiencing in a particular moment, right? But I think that's. I think that's what our conversations are really for the sake of. Finally, right? You opened us in the podcast by saying that you can conceive of your mission as to help every Catholic in the United States to handle his or her money affairs with a clear conscience, right? And that, to me, that sounds like freedom. That sounds like peace. That sounds like joy. So I think we're off to a good start, and so. A lot of work to do.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That is my mission, and it's a big mission, and you all are part of that. So I'm grateful to you for that. And I guess maybe I'll have maybe one last question for you, and if you want a second to think about it, it's fine. It's an easy question, I think. Can you think of a saint, maybe that's involved in your life and you're in theirs, or not, that our listeners and viewers, when they're thinking about theology of money and practical applications and sort of the heady in the cloud stuff too, that you would recommend someone ask for the intercession from? And I'll start. St. Joseph Arimathea is my patron and the true CEO of my company, Arimathea. And he is a man who exemplified virtues of courage, faith, and generosity at the time of our Lord's crucifixion. Of course, going to Pontius Pilate, act of courage and bravery, undoubtedly. I mean, here, you're going to a man who could have anyone crucified. Ask for our Lord's body. And of course, Pontius Pilate gives him the body of our Lord and St. Joseph's friend. And St. Joseph donates his new hewn tomb to our Lord. And that was his most valuable possession. I think you guys can see maybe some of the artifacts behind me. I am an amateur archaeologist, and your tomb was your most valuable possession in the ancient world. I mean, these things were very, very expensive. His was new, so it was new money. So he made it himself, and then he gave it to God. I mean, an act of generosity. But I think his act of faith, as an example for us in finance, is the most astounding. Here he gives this great wealth to God, who just borrows the place for a couple nights, doesn't even keep it. But, here you have this man who doesn't have the sacraments. He doesn't have the resurrection. He doesn't have the church and professors and books and all the things that we have to buttress my weak faith, for example. And yet he does this tremendous act of faith for God. What a wonderful example that we should be with our money. And with every dollar we have, we should be courageous, we should be faithful, and we should be generous. And if we mirror St. Joseph Arimathea's life in our day-to-day activities involving finance, I think it would transform the whole planet. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on maybe a saint that you have in mind, whether it's finance related specifically or not. But perhaps, Professor Owens, I'll start with you.
I was thinking there, St. Francis de Sales, great Counter-Reformation saint. He wrote maybe one of the best treatises on devotion, on the devout life for lay people ever, right? And one of the things I was just trying to see, I can't recall it. I feel positive he said something on money, but one of the things that strikes me is the counsel to prudence, right? Mm-hmm. And this is of the moral virtues. This is the first, right? Justice and temperance and fortitude you can't have without having prudence. because prudence is a habit of the intellect, and and he's very practical. He's very grounded, and it seems like one of the challenges of living in the world, whether it's the world of the Renaissance or whether it's the world of today, is how do you live your faith fully alive as a Catholic, with all of the concerns of day-to-day life, and one of those should be planning, right? And so I think as a great saint of prudence for the layman and the laywoman, Saint Francis de Sales just pops to my mind first. Of course, I've got other things to say about G.K. Chesterton, but his cause is not advancing, even if I think his writing is saintly, and certainly the man. But anyway, yeah, that'd
For
be
another podcast, perhaps we'll talk about go back and forth on that. But Dr. Blum, I'd love to hear your thoughts on a saint that we could ask for the intercession on in their financial lives.
Yeah, so by way of private devotion, Leon Harmel, Harmel, who was a factory owner and a beautiful Catholic man in 19th century France. And there's a trade school in Michigan that's opened up recently under his patronage, and we'll see whether his cause goes forward. But very, very fine example of what it means to put God first in all of one's business dealings.
Oh, that's beautiful. I've never heard of the man. I'll have to ask ChatGPT about him afterwards. So, Dr. de Solenni.
I have so many swirling in my head. So again, in a previous role, I was able to work closely with His Eminence Cardinal Pell. And after his death, I just continue to be incredibly moved by his example and ask for his intercession. If we're going to go for not canonized saint, but known saint, Our Lady, Seat of Wisdom, because navigating these things just takes so much. I mean, Professor Owens used the word prudence, and you also need, it takes so much prudence, and that prudence needs to be informed, and then it would help if there's some wisdom factoring into that whole equation.
Yeah.
So I think Our Lady, Seat of Wisdom, because that, to my mind, is what's missing from so many of these discussions, both practical, academic, lived, whatever you want to call it. It's the absence of wisdom. And so I think Our Lady, Seat of Wisdom, just to help us bring wisdom back into our lives, into the culture, and to help us prudently discern.
Oh, I think that's beautiful. If we all had a heart like our Blessed Mother, imagine the world that we would live in. So with that, I want to say thank you to my co-hosts. You guys have been very generous in putting up with my questions. I told you it'd be an easy day, but maybe it was a little harder than you expected. But I think we edify our listeners. I mean, this is what it's all about. And we're going to be doing this, folks, regularly. So if you can like and subscribe on the platform that you're listening on, we'd love you to follow us. And perhaps we'll do questions sometime from the audience. I think that'd be a lot of fun, too. But to my illustrious theologians on this podcast, thank you all very much for being here with us today. And God bless everybody that's listening.